What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
Imagine this unfolding in the dead of night when the clock strikes 1 in the morning and the relentless rain hammers against the roof of my modest suburban home in Chicago as if it's desperately trying to cleanse the accumulated grime of countless unspoken family tragedies, yanking me abruptly from a fitful sleep with a heavy thud echoing at the front door that sends my heart racing faster than it ever did during those high-stakes chases through the city's underbelly back in my FBI days, and there she stands on the threshold, my beloved daughter Maria, collapsed against the frame with her body trembling uncontrollably and her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps that barely sustain her. Her face a heartbreaking canvas of bruises swelling around her eyes, and a split lip oozing blood that mixes with the tears streaming down her cheeks. Whispering through sobs that rack her entire frame the devastating words that her husband Tom has struck her repeatedly in a fit of rage sparked by his illicit affair with some mistress he's been hiding away like a dirty secret tucked into the folds of his so-called perfect life. And in that charged moment Elena Vasquez, a retired agent pushing 60 with a lifetime of busting abusers and unraveling deceptions etched into my bones, choose to say absolutely nothing because words would only dilute the storm brewing inside me. Instead, I turn quietly toward the closet in the hallway where relics from my past life gather dust amid forgotten holiday decorations and old photo albums filled with snapshots of a younger me standing tall in crisp navy uniforms beside suspects in handcuffs, pulling out that very uniform now with hands steady from years of practice in high-pressure interrogations, and slipping it on over my rumpled nightclothes as if donning armor for a battle long overdue. The fabric still carrying a faint scent of starch and resolve that transports me back to the corridors of justice, where I once wielded authority like a weapon against men who thought they could hide their sins behind closed doors, and then I reach for my phone on the nightstand, its screen glowing ominously in the dim light as I dial a single number etched into my memory from decades of covert operations and whispered alliances, the voice on the other end crackling to life with a familiarity that cuts through the tension like a knife. And I deliver the command in a tone forged in the fires of unyielding determination. The plan starts now. Because no one lays a hand on my flesh and blood and emerges unscathed from the reckoning that follows. With Maria finally settled inside on the worn leather couch in the living room where the soft glow of a single lamp casts long shadows that dance across the walls adorned with family pictures capturing happier times before the cracks in our lives began to widen like fissures in a crumbling foundation, I drape a thick wool blanket around her shoulders, the one that still faintly smells of my late husband's aftershave, a man whose own betrayals had taught me the bitter taste of misplaced trust long before Maria ever walked down that aisle with Tom, and as she begins to pour out the harrowing details between hitched breaths and futile attempts to wipe away the evidence of her pain with the sleeve of her soaked jacket, describing how Tom's temper had erupted like a long-simmering volcano after she confronted him about the suspicious late nights and the perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his collars, shoving her forcefully against the sharp edge of the kitchen counter in their spacious McMansion on the outskirts of town where they were supposed to be building a future filled with barbecues and Little League games, leaving those ugly purple imprints on her arms that now serve as irrefutable testimony to the violence lurking beneath his polished corporate facade. I listen intently without interrupting because I've learned through countless cases that the truth emerges most clearly when given space to breathe, all the while brewing a pot of strong chamomile tea in the kitchen, whose steam rises like a veil of calm over the chaos threatening to engulf us. Handing her a mug that warms her chilled fingers and soothes the raw edges of her throat while my mind races ahead like it did during those endless stakeouts in unmarked vans parked under flickering streetlights, piecing together the fragments of information she's sharing about Tom's escalating paranoia and the mistress named Lisa, a sleek paralegal from his firm who apparently holds some sway over him that goes beyond mere physical attraction, perhaps leveraging secrets or promises that keep him entangled in a web of his own making. By the time the first hints of dawn begin to filter through the curtains, turning the sky from inky black to a reluctant gray that mirrors the uncertainty settling over our home, Maria has drifted into an uneasy sleep, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that's almost normal if you ignore the occasional flinch that betrays the nightmares playing out behind her closed eyelids. And I seize the moment to retreat to the garage where my old reliable laptop sits on a workbench cluttered with tools. From half-finished home repairs and dusty boxes of case files I could never quite bring myself to discard. Firing it up with a familiar hum that vibrates through the concrete floor and launching into a discreet digital reconnaissance using backdoor access tricks honed during joint operations with tech-savvy informants who taught me how to navigate the shadows of the internet without leaving footprints, pulling up Tom's work email threads that reveal a pattern of evasive communications laced with coded references to meetings that stretch far beyond standard office hours and motel reservations in seedy parts of the city where discretion comes at a premium. Nothing yet that screams definitive proof, but enough circumstantial smoke to convince me there's a roaring fire of deceit burning just out of sight. So I pick up the phone again and call Jimmy, my former partner from the bureau days, now lounging in retirement down in Florida amid palm trees and golf courses, but still plugged into a network of informants spanning from the Windy City's precincts to the sunny shores of Miami, briefing him in that terse-clipped manner we developed over late-night surveillances and shared cups of stale coffee. Requesting eyes on Thomas Harlan, the mid-level manager with a penchant for extracurricular activities that could unravel his entire facade, and he responds with a low chuckle that carries the weight of old camaraderie mixed with a hint of concern, remarking that I haven't lost my edge. Elena. Always diving headfirst into the fray where wiser folks would call for backup, but he agrees to dig quietly, promising initial reports by midday without alerting any official channels that might complicate things prematurely. As the morning light strengthens, casting beams across the kitchen table where I sit nursing a black coffee strong enough to fuel a double shift and reviewing the sparse but telling evidence on my screen, a wry smile tugs at my lips, thinking about the irony of Tom, the man who prides himself on climbing corporate ladders through charm and calculated risks, now facing the possibility of tumbling down due to his own hubris. And I craft my opening salvo with the precision of a seasoned interrogator. An anonymous email to his HR department at the insurance firm where he toils away in a cubicle surrounded by spreadsheets and false smiles, worded in vague yet pointed language suggesting potential workplace harassment involving personal relationships that could violate company policy and trigger a thorough internal audit without directly implicating anyone to avoid immediate backlash. Hitting send with a sense of grim satisfaction because there's something almost poetic in the idea of a cheaters bonus evaporating into thin air over what he assumes is just another Monday morning routine. And indeed, by noon the ripples begin to spread as Maria's phone buzzes insistently on the coffee table, pulling her awake with a start, her eyes widening in confusion before recognition dawns, and she answers Tom's call, his voice filtering through the speaker laced with that faint concern he deploys like a shield whenever cornered, demanding she return home immediately to discuss whatever storm is brewing. At his office, the edge in his tone sharp enough to cut through the domestic pretense they've both clung to for years. And as she hangs up, her face paling further while she twists her wedding ring around her finger like it's a talisman against the unraveling she's helped perpetuate by turning a blind eye to the warning signs. I recognize this as merely the first skirmish in a larger campaign, one where Tom's offhand mention during the call about knowing folks who could make pesky problems vanish entirely leaves me frozen in place, staring at the front door with a growing sense of unease, because I've poked what might be more than just a sleeping bear but a coiled serpent ready to strike back with venom I hadn't anticipated in this meticulously laid plan for retribution. Jimmy's voice crackled through the phone line later that afternoon while I stood at the stove flipping pancakes in a deliberate attempt to inject some semblance of normalcy into the day for Maria, who sat at the kitchen table nursing a fresh cup of coffee with her eyes still shadowed by the events of the night before and the mounting tension that hung in the air like the steam rising from the batter sizzling on the griddle, sharing light-hearted anecdotes from my bureau days about outmaneuvering smugglers who towered over me by feigning the role of a clueless tourist lost in the wrong part of town, which drew a tentative smile from her lips as she remarked that I sounded like a female version of James Bond minus the fancy gadgets and exploding pens that always seemed to complicate things in the movies, but that fragile moment of levity shattered almost immediately when Jimmy delivered his initial findings in that gravelly tone honed from years of barking orders over radio static, informing me that Tom wasn't just dipping into the corporate cookie jar for his dalliances, but maintaining a full-blown side hustle siphoning off company funds through a series of clever but sloppy transfers designed to cover the lavish motel stays and surprise gifts for Lisa the Mistress, who emerged in the details as far more than a fleeting office flirtation, but a calculating player with her own axes to grind against the firm, perhaps holding leverage from insider knowledge that kept Tom dancing to her tune like a puppet on frayed strings. And I absorbed the information with a nod to the empty kitchen, absorbing the weight of how this revelation painted Tom not as a mere philanderer, but as a man teetering on the edge of outright fraud, which opened up avenues for retaliation that went beyond personal slights into the realm of professional ruin, where the stakes felt deliciously high and justly deserved given the bruises still fading on Maria's skin. Thanking Jimmy profusely while promising to tread carefully, though my mind was already charting a course straight into the heart of the storm, I hung up and turned my attention to getting Maria to the doctor under the pretense of a routine checkup to ensure no internal injuries lingered from the altercation, but in reality to compile a medical record that could serve as ammunition later if things escalated beyond my controlled chaos. The physician, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a clipboard full of forms, clucked her tongue sympathetically at the visible marks and recommended considering a shelter or at least a restraining order, which Maria dismissed with a vehement shake of her head, insisting that she still harbored love for Tom despite his volatile hands and wandering affections, a declaration that twisted something deep inside me because it echoed the very rationalizations I'd clung to during my own marital unraveling when my ex Carlos, a fellow cop who'd started with cutting remarks and progressed to emotional detachment before vanishing with a younger colleague, left me raising Maria on a single income fueled by overtime and unspoken resentment, so I bit back the urge to lecture, holding her hand through the exam and driving us home in silence broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio playing oldies that reminded me of better days before secrets eroded the foundations of trust. Back at the house, with the afternoon sun slanting through the windows casting elongated shadows that seemed to mirror the lengthening list of Tom's indiscretions, I reached out to another ally from my past, Sarah, a brilliant tech specialist who'd transitioned to the private sector after I once pulled her teenage son out of a sticky situation involving a joyride gone wrong years earlier during a routine patrol that turned into an all-nighter of negotiations and paperwork requesting her assistance in tracing Tom's financial trails without setting off any digital alarms that might alert him to the scrutiny, and she came through like clockwork within hours, delivering a treasure trove of screenshots showing regular wire transfers to a joint account bearing Lisa's name. Transfers substantial enough to suggest not just an affair but a partnership in potential embezzlement that could freeze Tom's assets and career prospects if exposed in the right light. So armed with this intel, I orchestrated the next phase of my plan, crafting an elaborate fake alert disguised as an investor inquiry directed to Tom's superiors at the insurance conglomerate, implying irregularities in fund allocations tied to personal relationships that warranted immediate investigation. The wording precise yet ambiguous enough to ignite a full-blown internal probe without my fingerprints anywhere near the trigger, and as the effects rippled outward, manifesting in Tom's increasingly desperate voicemails to Maria pleading for her to intervene on his behalf at work by vouching for his integrity. Amid the whispers starting to circulate through the office corridors, she surprisingly complied, spinning tales of his dedication and dismissing the rumors as jealous sabotage, a choice that stung sharper than expected, revealing through her hesitant confessions over dinner that she'd been aware of the affair for months, choosing silence to preserve the home, the lifestyle, the illusion of the white picket fence they'd invested so much in, a complicity that boiled my blood because it mirrored my own past errors in ignoring Carlos's red flags for the sake of appearances and stability, though it didn't deter me from pressing forward with a secondary strike, anonymously alerting Lisa's husband, a sturdy mechanic with calloused hands and a reputation for zero tolerance toward betrayal, which unleashed a comedic yet chaotic backlash as the man confronted Tom at his golf club mid-swing, scattering onlookers and forcing an undignified Retreat that had me chuckling quietly from the safety of my living room while monitoring the fallout through Sarah's updates. Yet the humor evaporated swiftly when Tom appeared unannounced on my doorstep that evening, his suit rumpled and breath carrying the sharp tang of inexpensive scotch as he barged past Maria demanding answers about the sudden lockdown on his bank accounts and the unraveling of his carefully curated secrets, his eyes wild with a mix of accusation and fear that made the air thicken with impending confrontation, but I maintained my composure, offering him a seat and a cup of coffee laced with just enough feigned sympathy to disarm him while Maria lingered in the doorway, her loyalty fracturing visibly between us, and as he ranted about faceless enemies sabotaging his life, I caught glimpses of deeper desperation in his posture, the way his hands trembled slightly, suggesting entanglements beyond Lisa, perhaps debts or deals that my probes had unwittingly aggravated, and when he finally stormed out muttering vague threats about ensuring we regretted meddling in his affairs, the unease settled heavier, prompting me to double-check the locks and draw the curtains against the encroaching dusk. But later, as night deepened and my phone illuminated the darkened bedroom with an incoming call from a blocked number, an unfamiliar voice hissed through the receiver a warning to back off immediately or face consequences that would make my daughter's suffering look like a minor inconvenience, leaving me gripping the device tightly, heart pounding with the realization that Tom's suspicions had ignited something far more dangerous than I'd calculated in this escalating game of shadows and retribution. That chilling whisper from the blocked number lingered in my ears like an unwelcome echo in the quiet hours after midnight as I lay awake in the bed that had witnessed too many solitary nights since Carlos walked out, leaving behind a void filled with case files and cold dinners rather than the companionship I'd once imagined for my golden years, forcing me to rise before dawn and pace the kitchen floor with a mug of coffee that grew colder by the minute while contemplating the fine line between protective vengeance and reckless endangerment that my plan was now teetering upon, especially with Maria stirring upstairs, her sleep fitful and punctuated by murmurs that betrayed the internal war between her lingering affection for Tom and the undeniable evidence of his brutality etched into her flesh. So by the time she emerged bleary-eyed and wrapped in a robe that hung loosely on her frame, I masked my turmoil behind a breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast slathered with butter, suggesting a drive to her job at the local bank under the guise of moral support, but really to gauge how the ripples from my earlier strikes were affecting her daily routine, the one she'd built meticulously around teller windows and customer smiles as a way to anchor herself in the stability Tom had promised but never fully delivered. En route through the tree-lined streets of our suburban enclave, where manicured lawns hid the undercurrents of marital discord, much like the one now threatening to upend Maria's world, I cracked a few jokes to lighten the atmosphere, recounting a bungled stakeout from my early bureau days when I'd tripped over a garden hose while tailing a suspect, ending up covered in mud and drawing more attention than evasion, which elicited a genuine laugh from her for the first time in days as she quipped that my clumsiness must be genetic, since she'd once spilled coffee on a bank auditor during a performance review, turning a routine meeting into a slapstick comedy. But beneath the humor, the undercurrent of worry persisted because her phone had been buzzing incessantly with work-related queries that hinted at the storm brewing from Tom's corporate fallout, the anonymous posts I'd orchestrated with Sarah's digital finesse starting to circulate through community forums and social media circles, portraying him as the quintessential neighborhood sleaze with blurred photographs capturing his clandestine meetings with Lisa in dimly lit bars on the city's fringes, where arguments over money and risks escalated to the point of drawing sidelong glances from other patrons, fueling a wildfire of gossip among the PTA moms and weekend warriors who thrived on such scandals. Once we arrived at the bank with Maria steeling herself for the shift ahead, promising to call if anything felt off, I wasted no time looping in Frank, my retired cop neighbor whose divorce from a serial cheater had left him with a perpetual scowl and a talent for discreet surveillance, asking him to shadow Tom for the day under the cover of running errands in the same direction, and he agreed with an enthusiastic grunt over the fence separating our properties, remarking that this beat watching daytime TV reruns any day, while hinting at the satisfaction of turning the tables on a man who'd likely dismissed his own marital woes as mere rough patches, delivering by late afternoon a series of grainy photos snapped from a parked car showing Tom huddled with Lisa in a nondescript diner, their gestures animated and tense, with whispers about financial shortfalls and high-stakes gambles that suggested the affair had evolved into something perilously interdependent, perhaps a scheme to extract more from the firm than just illicit thrills, which crystallized my resolve to escalate the humiliation, crafting with Sarah's reluctant assistance a series of anonymous social media blasts that amplified the narrative of Tom's duplicity, complete with fabricated but plausibly deniable testimonials from supposed colleagues decrying his ethical lapses. The posts timed to hit during peak evening scrolling hours, ensuring maximum exposure among his professional network and social circle, leading to an emergency meeting at his office where his boss, a stern executive with zero patience for distractions, hauled him in for explanations that left his promotion prospects smoldering like a cigarette, but ground under heel a revenge that carried a witty sting as I imagined him squirming in that conference room, defending his honor to faces he'd schmoozed for years. But the levity curdled quickly when Maria texted mid-afternoon, her message laced with panic, revealing that her supervisor had pulled her aside for a hushed conversation, alluding to rumors linking her personally to Tom's alleged misconduct, whispers that could jeopardize her position at the bank, the very job that provided her a sliver of independence amid the marital turmoil, forcing me to confront the dilemma head-on as I paced the living room, wondering if my pursuit of poetic justice was inadvertently clipping Maria's wings in ways she'd never forgive, especially since her choice to cover for Tom during the HR inquiry earlier that week had now boomeranged back, painting her as an accomplice in the eyes of prying colleagues, a bitter pill that echoed my own past decisions to shield Carlos's indiscretions from our social circle at the cost of my own reputation and peace of mind. Undeterred yet increasingly haunted by the moral tightrope, I arranged the next layer of social sabotage, a faux delivery service mix-up that deposited an innocuous-looking package at their home address containing what appeared to be Lisa's intimate correspondence, laced with details of their escapades and financial entanglements forged meticulously to incite paranoia, without direct traceability, scheduled to arrive smack in the middle of Tom's weekly poker night with his so-called buddies, a group of middle-aged executives who prided themselves on loyalty but folded like cheap suits under pressure. And from my vantage point across the street, parked in Frank's borrowed sedan with binoculars trained on the scene, the chaos unfolded like a poorly scripted farce. Shouts erupting from the living room windows as Tom ripped open the box, his face contorting in horror, while one friend bolted for the door, muttering about not getting mixed up in this mess, another chuckling nervously before excusing himself to the bathroom, never to return, leaving Tom isolated amid scattered cards and half-empty beer bottles, a bungled attempt at normalcy that dissolved into accusations and slammed doors, providing a momentary rush of satisfaction, laced with dark humor at the sight of his empire of illusions crumbling under the weight of his own deceptions. But the triumph soured as Frank relayed an update via text describing Tom's subsequent detour to a run-down warehouse district on the industrial edge of town, where he met a cluster of rough-hewn figures in leather jackets exchanging furtive handshakes and envelopes that screamed illicit dealings, loans perhaps to bankroll the affair or cover embezzlement shortfalls, with strings attached from lenders who operated in gray areas far removed from corporate boardrooms, dropping subtle clues about the depth of Tom's entanglements, connections that hinted at dangers I hadn't fully anticipated in my calculated strikes. And as evening deepened into night, with Maria returning home subdued and recounting how her bankroll felt precarious under the shadow of association, my phone rang unexpectedly, the caller ID flashing a number from my distant past, one I'd buried under layers of retirement routines, only to have it resurface now, pulling me toward revelations that could upend everything in this spiraling web of retribution and regret. The insistent ring of that long-buried phone number from my past reverberated through the quiet house like a ghost demanding reckoning as I snatched up the receiver in the dim glow of the hallway lamp, its light flickering slightly from an aging bulb that cast erratic shadows across the walls lined with faded family portraits, capturing moments of feigned bliss before the fractures in our lives became impossible to ignore, the caller turning out to be none other than Detective Reyes, a grizzled veteran from my FBI tenure who'd mentored me through my first big case involving a domestic ring that preyed on vulnerable women in the city's underbelly, his voice roughened further by years of chain-smoking and late-night stakeouts, warning me in no uncertain terms that my meddling in Tom's affairs had pinged on his radar through mutual contacts hinting at the warehouse connections I'd glimpsed earlier, those low-rent lenders operating in the shadows of legitimate finance with ties to old busts I'd helped orchestrate back in the 90s when we dismantled their network, only for remnants to slither back into the cracks of the economy, suggesting that Tom's desperation had drawn him into a viper's nest far more perilous than a mere extramarital fling, and, as he advised, pulling back before the feds got wind of my unofficial vigilante antics, I felt a surge of defiance, mingled with the familiar twinge of doubt that had plagued my career choices, the ones where bending rules to protect the innocent sometimes blurred into endangering them further, much like the moral quandaries Maria now faced in her tangled loyalty to a man who'd marked her body and spirit alike. With dawn breaking through the curtains in hues of reluctant pink that barely warmed the chill settling over the kitchen where Maria had joined me for a hurried breakfast, her appetite non-existent, as she picked at a slice of toast slathered with jam, I almost unburdened myself, then spilling the secrets I'd guarded for decades about my own marriage to Carlos, not one marred by physical blows like Tom's, but by a relentless erosion of emotional abuse, the kind that started with dismissive comments about my long hours at the bureau, escalating to isolation tactics, where he'd undermine my confidence in front of friends and family, planting seeds of doubt that blossomed into a full-blown affair with his desk sergeant, a betrayal I discovered through anonymous tips much like the ones I now wielded against Tom, choosing silence to shield young Maria from the fallout, prioritizing the facade of a stable home over the raw honesty that might have empowered her to spot the red flags in her own union. A revelation that tied our stories together in a painful loop of inherited patterns where I'd enabled the very cycles of deception she now perpetuated by funneling money to Lisa in hushed side deals to buy silence and avert the scandal of divorce in our judgmental suburban circle, a complicity she'd confessed in hushed tones the night before, admitting she'd overlooked Tom's rages as stress from work pressures, much as I'd rationalized Carlos's barbs as the toll of his beat cop grind, leaving me to wonder if my current crusade was truly liberation or just another layer of the same dysfunctional legacy. Undaunted by the warnings, yet haunted by the parallels, I coordinated the next trap with Sarah over an encrypted call, her reluctance palpable as she described the digital breadcrumbs she'd laid, leading Tom's lenders straight to his concealed stash of pilfered funds uncovered in the depths of his cloud storage, a clever ruse designed to portray him as the ultimate deadbeat by amplifying a bogus insurance claim he'd filed on their home, citing an accidental garage demolition during one of his fits, a claim ripe for exposure as fraudulent if the goons descended upon it expecting repayment, only to find the pot empty and the trail pointing back to embezzlement, the execution unfolding with precision as I monitored from a coffee shop down the block, my laptop screen alive with alerts showing the lender's crew converging on Tom's office mid-morning, dragging him into a back alley for what promised to be a persuasive discussion that left him hobbling back to his desk with a limp and a newfound wariness, a revenge laced with wry satisfaction at the irony of his own aggressive tendencies, boomeranging through proxies who mirrored his brutality without my direct involvement, though I knew deep down the audience, watching this unfold in their minds, would recoil at the ethics of sicking such unsavory elements on him, even deservedly, because it skirted too close to the vigilante justice I'd sworn off upon retirement, involving innocents like the office staff who scattered in panic and the bystanders who whispered about the disturbance, risking broader fallout that could ensnare Maria further in the web of suspicion already threatening her bank job, where colleagues eyed her with newfound skepticism, linking her bruises to the rumors now swirling like smoke from a dumpster fire. The day's tension peaked when Maria returned home earlier than usual, her face drawn with exhaustion from a supervisor's probing questions about her personal life and its potential overlap with workplace ethics, a direct consequence of the social ripples I'd set in motion, forcing her to defend not just her marriage, but her own integrity in a role that demanded impartiality and trust, eroding the fragile independence she'd carved out amid the domestic storm. And as we sat on the porch watching the Sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of amber and regret. She pressed me for the full story behind my uniform, and the shadowy calls demanding to know why I couldn't simply advocate for a clean break through legal channels, like any ordinary mother. Rather than this clandestine war that painted me as the antagonist in her eyes, a confrontation that unearthed more about my past, the way Carlos's emotional barbs had left invisible scars, teaching me to fight fire with calculated flames, but also isolating me from the support I might have sought, leaving Maria to inherit a legacy of stoic endurance over open vulnerability. And just as I began to articulate the ambiguities of protection versus control, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from Tom's number, his voice slurring through the line, thick with venom and alcohol, as he hissed threats about making sure Maria suffered irreparably if I didn't cease my interference, the words laced with a specificity that chilled me to the core, mentioning details about her routine at the bank that suggested surveillance far beyond his corporate reach. And in that instant, as headlights swept unexpectedly across the driveway, illuminating figures lurking in the shadows, the cliffhanger of impending retaliation crystallized, forcing me to shove Maria inside and barricade the door, heart thundering with the realization that my quest for retribution had ignited a blaze threatening to consume us all in its uncontrolled fury. Those ominous headlights slicing through the enveloping darkness of the driveway like accusatory beams from an interrogation room long past pulled me into immediate action as I shoved Maria back through the threshold of the front door, urging her in a hushed, urgent whisper to secure every lock and bolt while dialing Jimmy's number. If the shadows coalescing outside resolved into anything more tangible than paranoia born from Tom's venomous threats, the air thick with the scent of impending rain and the metallic tang of fear that coated my tongue, reminding me of nights spent in unmarked cars waiting for perps to make their fatal mistake. Only now the stakes twisted inward, threatening the very heart of my world. As I stepped onto the porch, my hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm that wasn't there anymore, retired and holstered in a safe deposit box, but the old uniform's phantom weight on my shoulders lending a semblance of authority to the confrontation brewing, with the engine's low rumble idling just beyond the glow of the street lamp, revealing not a squad of enforcers as I'd half feared, but merely a delivery van making a late-night drop-off for the neighbor whose online shopping habits rivaled Maria's attempts at normalcy during her marital strife. A false alarm that left me deflated yet electrified, propelling me back inside to plot the endgame with Sarah over a secure video link, her face illuminated by the blue hue of multiple screens as she confirmed the final digital snare, a labyrinthine trail of forged transactions routing Tom's concealed embezzled funds directly into the crosshairs of his lender's scrutiny, while simultaneously alerting the authorities through an anonymous whistleblower protocol that painted him as the architect of a sophisticated fraud scheme, the kind that could bury him under federal charges for years, ensuring not just personal payback, but systemic justice that echoed the cases I'd closed in my prime, though laced with the witty irony of him ensnaring himself in the very web of deceit he'd spun for his affair and indulgences. As the plan locked into motion with Sarah's keystrokes sealing the virtual noose, I turned to Maria, who had emerged from her barricaded room, eyes wide with a mixture of accusation and desperation, demanding in a voice cracking under the strain why I'd orchestrated this clandestine warpath instead of advocating for the straightforward path of divorce papers and therapy sessions, the kind of resolution touted in every self-help book and daytime talk show that promised healing without the collateral wreckage now jeopardizing her job, her safety, and the fragile remnants of the family unit we'd both fought to preserve. Her words slicing deeper than any blade because they forced me to confront the moral quagmire at the core of my vengeance, the way my choices blurred the noble intent of maternal protection into a vigilante crusade that disregarded the human cost, much like the ethical dilemmas I'd navigated in the bureau, where bending rules to collar a monster sometimes orphaned innocence in the process. And in that raw exchange, she revealed the final twist, a screenshot from Lisa claiming that Tom's rages weren't isolated to her, but symptomatic of a deeper unraveling tied to financial pressures from the affair's extravagances, which Maria had quietly subsidized, not out of blind loyalty, but to forestall the shame of public dissolution in our community, where divorces still carried the stigma of failure, especially for women who'd vowed till death do us part, a confession that mirrored my own buried history with Carlos, whose emotional manipulations I'd endured in silence to maintain the illusion of stability for her sake, planting seeds of doubt that now bloomed into her complicity, leaving me reeling with the realization that my grand reckoning might be punishing the symptoms rather than excising the generational rot we'd both nurtured through inaction, the audience surely bristling at my unyielding pursuit, even as it delivered the satisfying spectacle of Tom's downfall, because involving such shadowy elements as the lenders risked ensnaring bystanders like Lisa's family or Maria's colleagues in a broader scandal that no amount of clever misdirection could fully contain. The climax erupted by midday when Jimmy's call came through, breathless and laced with the urgency of a man who'd seen too many ops go sideways, informing me that the lenders had descended upon Tom's office in a frenzy triggered by the baited funds vanishing into thin air, leading to a chaotic standoff where he attempted to barter his way out, only to have the authorities swoop in, sirens blaring through the corporate park as the whistleblower tip bore fruit, hauling him away in cuffs, his face a mask of stunned betrayal glimpsed through the squad car's window, where he locked eyes with me from afar, having spotted my surveillance perch across the street, a smirk twisting his lips as if to say this wasn't over. The arrest broadcast through Sarah's feeds detailing charges of embezzlement, assault, and fraud that would strip him of his suburban trappings, the McMansion, the golf club membership, the veneer of success, all crumbling under the weight of exposed lies, providing a rush of vindication laced with dark humor at the sight of his colleagues scattering like rats from a sinking ship. But the triumph hollowed out swiftly as Maria burst into the house, phone clutched in white-knuckled grip, showing messages from Lisa pleading for mercy and revealing that Tom had cut a desperate deal with the lenders beforehand, fingering me as the puppet master behind the leaks in a bid to shift blame, and by leniency his confession twisting the narrative to portray my interventions as extortionate harassment. A maneuver that now had detectives knocking on my door, their badges glinting under the porch light as they grilled me about unauthorized access and potential obstruction, the very sins I'd danced around in my plan, forcing Jimmy to expend favors from his retirement network to stall the inquiry while I sat rigid on the living room couch, the discarded uniform folded neatly on the armrest, symbolizing the life I'd briefly resurrected only to question its cost. In the charged aftermath, with Tom remanded pending trial, his fate dangling in the balance of plea deals and evidence reviews, Maria confronted me one final time, tears carving paths down her cheeks as she weighed forgiving the man she'd loved against the mother who'd liberated her through methods that skirted the law's edges, her divided heart echoing the ambiguities I'd lived with since Carlos's departure, wondering if true justice lay in retribution's cold grip or in the messy forgiveness that mends rather than destroys. And as the sun set over our fractured home, casting long shadows that blurred the line between protector and perpetrator, I retreated to the quiet of my bedroom, phone silenced against further intrusions, reflecting on the unanswered threats, like whether Maria would rebuild without the chains of abuse, or if my cycle of silence had doomed her to repeat the patterns, the lender's shadows lingering as potential loose ends that could resurface, and the deeper question of whether I'd served justice or merely inflicted another layer of scars on the family ledger, leaving it all suspended in that gray expanse where right and wrong entwine like lovers in a toxic embrace, prompting endless rumination on the true price of love's defense in a world that rarely offers clean resolutions.